How far can your charm take you? Well, if you can sell world landmarks, fool bankers with a signature, or trick the rich into funding your lifestyle, then you just might belong on this list. From fake nobility and forged checks to romance cons that drained millions, these scams rewrote the rulebook. But before we dive in, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe with that notification bell. It really helps the channel. I'm Mike with List 25, and these are 25 of the world's greatest con artists and the scams that made them famous. 25. Frank Abagnale. How can we not start with one of the greatest? In the 60s, Frank Abagnale Jr. built an entire life out of being someone else. Over just 5 years, this identity switcher passed more than $2.5 million in bad checks across 26 countries, and he wasn't even 30 yet. One day, he was a Pan Am pilot. The next, he was sliding into a doctor's coat to run a hospital ward. He even pulled off a stint as a lawyer without anyone realizing he hadn't actually passed the bar. One of his favorite moves was slipping his own account number onto fake deposit slips so that unsuspecting customers would fund his adventures. When banks caught on, he was usually already long gone. Arrests in France and Sweden slowed him down, but he famously escaped more than once by posing as a prison inspector. Eventually, the US probably realized they had to get him on their side and cut him a deal. Today, he's a multi-millionaire running a financial fraud security consultancy and still gets called in as an expert on financial crimes. 24. Victor Lustig. Victor's resume reads like a greatest hits album of cons. He swindled Al Capone and walked away alive, sold the Eiffel Tower not once, but twice, and peddled a useless contraption he called the Money Box for tens of thousands of dollars a pop. The gadget reportedly used radium to copy $100 bills, but all it did was spit out a few real notes he'd planted inside before turning worthless. By 1925, Lustig had upgraded to Paris, where he posed as a government official and held secret meetings with scrap metal dealers. His pitch? The Eiffel Tower was being torn down, and he was in charge of the sale. One eager bidder even threw in a bribe to sweeten the deal. In America, he turned to counterfeiting, producing $100 bills so convincing they rattled the treasury. Arrested in 1935, he briefly escaped before being locked up for good with a 20-year sentence at Alcatraz. 23. Charles Ponzi. Have you ever heard the phrase, Ponzi scheme? Yeah, there's an actual man behind that name. Charles Ponzi was an Italian immigrant who came to America with a couple of dollars in his pocket and a knack for spinning stories. He bounced around odd jobs and even did a little prison time before stumbling upon the idea that would make him famous: international postal reply coupons. On paper, it looked genius. Buy them cheap overseas, resell them in the US for a huge profit. He promised investors they'd double their money in 3 months. The problem was that there were never enough coupons in circulation to cover what he was promising. All he really had was fresh cash coming in from new investors to pay off the old ones. It worked for a while. He bought a mansion, lived like royalty, and had crowds lining up to hand him money. But the math was doomed, and when reporters and federal agents dug in, the whole thing collapsed. Ponzi pleaded guilty to mail fraud, landed back in prison, and was eventually deported to Italy, where he died completely broke in 1949. 22. Henri Lemoine. People have been trying to cook up diamonds forever, but only one man managed to convince the richest jewel dealers in the world that he'd actually pulled it off. In 1905, Henri Lemoine pulled De Beers executives into his Paris laboratory for their very own private show. To prove he wasn't smuggling any diamonds in, he stripped down, tossed coal and mystery chemicals into a furnace, and when it cooled, showed them a handful of glittery stones. That was enough to hook Sir Julius Werner and a line of other wealthy backers who poured money into Lemoine's research. He pocketed more than 1.5 million francs before a jeweler admitted that he'd been selling Lemoine diamonds all along. Dragged into court, the so-called alchemist couldn't reproduce his miracle and fled before sentencing. De Beers never got their money back, and Lemoine disappeared. 21. Gregor MacGregor. Gregor might have been the greatest con artist of all time. In the early 1820s, he sold an entire country. He was granted 12,500 square miles of land on the Mosquito Coast by the local king after fighting in Latin America's independence wars. And while the land was real, what MacGregor did with it was pure invention. When he arrived back in Britain, he told everyone that he had been crowned prince. The soil, he claimed, could yield 2 or 3 harvests a year. Its rivers glittered with gold and its cities were full of impressive architecture. Investors wanted in. And in no time at all, MacGregor collected roughly $200,000, and more than 250 settlers were on their way to the promised land. After 6 weeks at sea, they landed on the Mosquito Coast, and the name proved accurate. What they found was swamp, jungle, and clouds of insects. Malaria killed most of them, and only about 50 survivors ever managed to get back home. 20. Emmanuel Nwude. Long before the rise of all the Nigerian prince emails, one man in Nigeria managed to sell something far bigger, an airport that never existed. In the late 90s, Emmanuel Nwude posed as the governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria and approached Nelson Sakaguchi, a Brazilian bank director, with an offer that was too good to be true. Fund a brand new airport in Abuja and pocket a $10 million commission once it was complete. Sakaguchi took the bait. Over time, he wired more than $190 million in cash and millions more in interest payments. Nwude and his crew managed to get over $240 million before they got shut down, making it one of the largest banking scams in history. 19. George C. Parker. This was the man who sold the Brooklyn Bridge. Not once, but again and again, sometimes even multiple times per week. George C. Parker convinced his wide-eyed buyers that they could cash in by charging tolls, and more than once, police had to drag the new owners off the bridge as they tried to set up their gates. Parker also managed to sell Madison Square Garden, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Grant's Tomb, and the Statue of Liberty. He came prepared too. Fake deeds, forged documents, and even a full office set up to make it all look official. Sometimes he even introduced himself as General Grant's grandson to seal the deal. After 3 fraud convictions, Parker was sentenced to life at Sing Sing in 1928, where he spent his final years spinning stories of his outrageous sales for guards and fellow inmates. 18. Lou Blonger. While the Wild West had its fair share of gunslingers, Denver's most dangerous man used paper, not bullets. Lou Blonger started as a child soldier in the Union Army, and after the Civil War, he and his brother Sam drifted west, looking for opportunity. At first, it was prospecting, gambling, and running saloons. But by the late 1800s, Lou had outgrown the saloon hustle. He built himself up as Denver's ultimate bunco boss, had politicians in his pockets, cops looking the other way, and he even managed to push other frontier swindlers out of town. With Sam backing him, Lou's empire grew into what locals called the $1 Million Bunco Ring. They ran fake stock exchanges, rigged horse races, and even had phony investment offices. Many people never even realized they'd been taken. And for the ones who did, by the time they went to the police, Lou had already been tipped off and vanished from the records. 17. Soapy Smith. Soapy Smith's claim to fame was soap. That's right, bars of soap. He'd set up a stand in the middle of town, stack it with bars of soap, and wrap a few of them with real money. Sometimes just $1, sometimes $100. Then he'd cover them all in plain paper so nobody could tell which bars had the cash. The catch was simple. He sold the soap for $1 a bar, turning it into a kind of street lottery. To get the crowd worked up, one of his own men would buy a bar, tear it open, and discover the money inside. People saw that and thought they had a real shot, so they started throwing down dollars, hoping to be the one who scored the big prize. He kept that hustle, and plenty more like it, going for nearly 20 years, until he got gunned down by the townsfolk in the middle of the street. 16. Eduardo de Valfierno. Most people know the Mona Lisa once got stolen from the Louvre, but almost nobody remembers the man who orchestrated it. The man who called himself the Marquis never actually wanted the painting, he just wanted it to disappear. And in 1911, he arranged exactly that. paying Louvre employee Vincenzo Perugia to tuck it under his coat and walk right out the front door. Before the theft even happened, Valfierno had already hired a skilled restorer to make 6 perfect copies. So while the world reeled over the missing masterpiece, those fakes were already being shipped off to wealthy collectors everywhere around the world. Each and every one of them thought they were getting the real thing. Valfierno never even checked back in with Perugia. He had made his money the moment the Mona Lisa vanished. Perugia was later caught trying to sell the actual painting, and the Louvre got it back in 1913. Meanwhile, Valfierno simply disappeared, having pulled off what might be the greatest art scam in history, without ever laying a finger on the real thing. 15. Simon Leviev. Some cons play out in back alleys or smoky saloons. This one played out on Tinder. Simon Leviev, real name Shimon Hayat, posed as the son of a diamond mogul and convinced women that he was rich, powerful, and in danger. The pitch worked. He's believed to have made almost $10 million while his dates racked up loans and debt to help him. Netflix blew his cover in 2022 with The Tinder Swindler, but Leviev hardly faded from history. He only served 5 months in an Israeli prison, and by the time the documentary dropped, he was back out in the world, calling himself a gentleman and insisting that it was all a big misunderstanding. Since then, he's tried everything, from launching a cryptocurrency called Tind to pitching a dating show, but none of it really stuck. 14. Mithilesh Kumar Srivastava. India's most legendary swindler is better known by a single name, Natwarlal. A trained lawyer with a gift for forgery, he could copy a signature just by watching someone write once. With that skill, along with more than 50 aliases, he managed cons so outrageous, they sound like folklore. He sold the Taj Mahal not once, but 3 separate times, and threw in the Red Fort, the Parliament House, and even the Presidential Palace, just for good measure. The money he stole from businessmen and institutions ran into the millions, and prosecutors across 8 states filed over 100 cases against him. Courts handed him sentences adding up to 113 years, but Natwarlal never stayed put. He slipped out of custody 9 different times. Once, he simply put on a stolen police uniform and walked away. Another time, he escaped during a midnight hospital visit. His final victory came in 1996, when the 84-year-old rolled into New Delhi railway station in a wheelchair and was never seen again. His brother claimed that he died that same year, but to this day, nobody knows for sure when or if India's most productive con man actually died. 13. Reed Kid Waddell. You'd think a well-off kid from Springfield, Illinois would have no reason to hustle, but Reed Waddell found one. His opening game was the green goods racket, pamphlets advertising perfect counterfeit cash. The catch was simple. Buyers never got their money, and they couldn't exactly run to the police. But Waddell's real specialty was the gold brick scam. He'd take a block of lead, coat it in real gold, stamp it with official-looking markings, and even insert a plug of genuine gold so a jeweler could test it. Wealthy farmers and investors thought they were buying a fortune for pennies on the dollar. In reality, they were buying scrap metal, and Waddell was pocketing thousands at the time. He supposedly made over $250,000 this way, enough to make him a legend, but greed caught up with him. He moved his operations to Paris, but was fatally wounded after being shot by his partner in 1895. 12. Robert Hendy-Freegard. The world's worst wannabe spy started out as a barman and a car salesman, but somewhere along the way he decided pretending to be MI5 was a much better gig. He convinced people that they were targets of the IRA, demanded that they cut themselves off from their families, hand over their cash, and even sleep on airport benches to prove their loyalty. By the time police finally staged a sting at Heathrow in 2002, he'd left a trail of ruined lives behind. He ended up in prison in the UK for 6 years after that, and you'd think that might have been the end of him. Not even close. After getting out of prison, he moved to rural France under a false name and started breeding dogs, trying to keep a low profile. That is, until Netflix dropped 2 documentaries about his past. When French police turned up at his home in 2022 to ask him a few questions, he panicked, hit the gas, and ran over 2 police officers. In 2025, French courts sentenced him to 6 more years in jail, with the judge calling him manipulative to the end. 11. Lord Gordon Gordon. Nobody's ever figured out who this mysterious man really was. Still, in the 1870s, he managed to fool bankers, businessmen, and even one of the wealthiest tycoons in America by pretending to be a Scottish nobleman. He first popped up in 1868 as Lord Glencairn, trying to get a Scottish estate. By the time people realized he was a fraud, he was already sailing for the US. In Minnesota, he rebranded himself as Lord Gordon Gordon and turned his sights on the booming railroad industry. One executive poured $45,000 into courting him, believing the mysterious lord would invest millions in return. Of course, that never happened. Then came his boldest move. In New York, he convinced Jay Gould, the railroad baron, that he controlled 60,000 Erie Railway shares. Gould handed over $1 million in stock and $200,000 in cash before realizing he'd been played. Eventually, he found himself in trouble with the law in Canada, but he threw one last party in Manitoba before taking his own life. 10. Bernard Cornfeld. In the 60s, Bernard Cornfeld was throwing parties in Switzerland that looked more like something you'd see in Hollywood than high finance. His firm, Investors Overseas Services, raised more than $2.5 billion by selling mutual funds abroad, and Cornfeld skimmed off a personal fortune of over $100 million. His road to riches wasn't obvious. Born in Turkey, he came to the US as a boy, sold mutual funds despite a heavy stammer, and even ran a weight-guessing booth at Coney Island before finding his angle. With iOS, he sidestepped US regulations by planting his headquarters just across the French border, and the money poured in. But in 1973, hundreds of his own employees accused him of pocketing cash from a stock scheme. Swiss authorities threw him in jail for 11 months before releasing him on bail. When he returned to Beverly Hills, the wild parties were gone. Cornfeld swapped champagne for vitamins and slipped into a quieter life until his death in 1995. 9. Joseph Hungry Joe Lewis. I've already told you about Lou Blonger, who was a master when it came to bunco rackets. But Hungry Joe took the same game and aimed it at celebrities. His list of victims included Civil War hero General John A. Logan, Judge Noah Davis, and even Charles Francis Adams, the son of a U.S. president. But his most famous mark was Oscar Wilde. During Wilde's 1882 American tour, Joe walked away with a $5,000 check. Wilde was quick enough to cancel it before he could cash it, but the story still spread. Joe's undoing wasn't brilliance, but panic. In 1885, while trying to fleece a visiting English businessman, he skipped the card game setup and just grabbed the cash. Police caught him within hours, and he finally served real time. 8. Joseph Yellow Kid Weil. One of the slickest operators of his era, this racketeer claimed to have walked away with more than $8 million over his career. It all started out simple enough. While working as a debt collector, he noticed that some of his coworkers were skimming money. But instead of reporting them, he demanded a cut of what they took to keep quiet. From there, he built a reputation as a bit of a shapeshifter. One day, he would pitch himself as a geologist with incredible oil deals. The next, he was a polished company director selling land that didn't even exist, or even a chemist who promised he could duplicate dollar bills. Whatever role he played, the outcome was always the same. Weil won big time. Later in life, he insisted that people's greed is what led them to being duped, not him. In other words, if you fell for his schemes, he thought you deserved it. 7. William Thompson. Not every great con relies on forged checks or fake empires. William Thompson's scam was almost laughably simple, and yet his actions actually led to the word confidence man. In 1840s New York, Thompson would dress up to look like a gentleman and approach wealthy strangers as if they were old friends. After a bit of polite conversation, he would lean in with the line that made his reputation. Did they have the confidence to trust him with their gold watch or a little cash until tomorrow? People, for some reason, said yes, and Thompson would stroll off with the goods while his mark was still trying to figure out what had just happened. His run ended in 1849 when one victim, Thomas MacDonald, spotted him on the street and called over a police officer. He didn't walk away with millions, but his nickname stuck. Every con man you've ever heard of since owes the title to him. 6. William Elmer Mead. He never smoked, never swore, and sat in church every Sunday. So nobody could believe it when the guy who had become known as the Christian Kid pulled in more than $2 million over his lifetime of cons. His move was something called the magic wallet. Mead and a partner would discover a wallet in front of someone they wanted to rope in. Together, they'd return it to its supposed owner, who was secretly part of the setup. Playing the role of a grateful businessman, that owner would then offer a special investment as a thank you. Mead, pretending to be just another bystander, would vouch that it sounded legitimate, which made the whole thing feel safe. The real target, the outsider caught in the middle, was the one who handed over the money. One of his biggest scores came in 1910, when he convinced a wealthy contractor to lease out stadiums for the crowds that were supposedly going to line up to see Halley's Comet. The comet came and went. Nobody booked a seat, and Mead smiled all the way to the bank. 5. James Hogue. Who needs fake diamonds or phony oil deals when you can fake your way into the Ivy League? Hogue showed up at Princeton in the 80s, calling himself Alexei Indra Santana, a self-taught orphan from Utah who supposedly raised sheep in the Grand Canyon and spent his nights reading philosophy under the stars. It was a beautiful story, and as you can imagine, the university ate it up. He got admitted, received financial aid, heck, even a spot on the track team. The truth, however, was that his name was James Hogue, and just a couple of years earlier, he'd been busted in California for posing as a teen and stealing bike parts. A former classmate eventually recognized him, and the whole Princeton fantasy unraveled. He was convicted of defrauding the school of about $30,000 and sentenced to prison. Now that might have been the end, but Hogue didn't know when to stop. In 1993, he turned up at Harvard, this time as a museum security guard. When rare gems started changing places with cheap fakes, police traced it back to him, and he eventually landed himself back in prison. 4. Comte de Saint-Germain. When the guy known as Casanova calls someone the king of imposters and quacks, you know they've earned the title. The Comte de Saint-Germain was less a man and more a walking legend. Depending on who you asked, he was either a Portuguese noble, a Jewish exile, or a sorcerer who had been alive for centuries. He never corrected anyone. In fact, when asked his age, he'd casually say he was 300 years old. He dazzled the courts with talk of alchemy and promised that he knew how to turn base metals into gold. One day he was selling wonder drugs, the next he was playing violin like a master or debuting music for an opera. Saint-Germain spent his last years chasing the dream of immortality. Whether he found it or not is still up for debate. But some people swore they saw him alive years after his supposed death. 3. Oscar Hartzell. Few scams on today's list managed to drag on as long as the supposed fortune of Sir Francis Drake. It began in 1915, when smooth talkers started claiming that the British government owed Drake's descendants a massive estate. At first, they only targeted people with the surname Drake. But once the money started pouring in, they opened it to anyone who wanted the share of the imaginary treasure. Oscar Hartzell's own mother invested $6,500, and before long, he was brought in as a recruiter. When he discovered the whole thing was a fraud, he didn't walk away. He pushed out the original operators and decided to run it himself. Hartzell lived comfortably from his home in London for almost 15 years, while thousands of Americans mailed in their investments. At its peak, he pulled in about $20,000 every month. The charade finally unraveled in 1933 when U.S. postal inspectors traced the endless letters to his address. 2. Ellen Peck. I know. It's terrible that we only covered one woman on today's list, but that's why we've got next time, right? Ellen Peck was nicknamed the Queen of Confidence Women, and there's a good reason for that. Her career stretched over 5 decades, and by the 1890s, police estimated she had taken more than $1 million from her victims, the equivalent of tens of millions today. Her early successes were bold. In 1878, she convinced soap magnate Benjamin Babbitt that she was a detective who could recover his stolen bonds, then turned around and posed as a wealthy socialite to swindle jewel dealer John Grady out of his stock. From there, she just kept piling up schemes. In 1909, when she was in her 60s, she was arrested and sent to prison. Newspapers called her sentence of 10 years a death sentence, but the governor pardoned her after only 2. Ellen treated the pardon like a green light. By 1914, she was arrested again for a mining scam. She was 62. 1. Carlos Kaiser. Only in Brazil could a man fake an entire football career and be loved for it. Kaiser's career lasted more than 20 years, not because of goals or talent, but because he built a web of friendships and fake resumes. Whenever someone got too close to the truth, he faked a sudden injury or stirred up trouble to avoid being found out. At every new team, he arrived with glowing references and a winning smile. Fans were paid to chant his name, youth players were bribed to knock him over in practice, and every story only added to his legend. When one mob-connected owner demanded he get on the pitch, Kaiser got in a fight with fans before he could be subbed in. He was red-carded and, unbelievably, rewarded with a contract extension. He didn't score a single goal, but he still carved out a 20-year career as football's greatest pretender. And that's a wrap. I guess it is true. If you can fake it, you can make it. But hold up, because I've got a trivia question for you. Which famous con man used soap to get rich? Was it A, Soapy Gordon, B, Soapy Hogue, C, Soapy Smith, or D, Soapy MacGregor? Drop your answer in the comments below. And while you're at it, tell me if you'd like more content like this. And if you want to test how easily you can be fooled, well, you'll love our related video. 25 brain-bending puzzles that'll make you doubt everything. From centuries-old contraptions to puzzles that could drive you insane with one wrong move, they were made to test your patience and your pride. So just watch for that link somewhere over here. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you again next time. Promise, not a con. I'll be back.